People can come up with all sorts of alternative explanations to Christ's resurrection. Maybe the disciples stole the body, or maybe Jesus was just mostly dead, or that it was just a hallucination that the apostles had as a result of their grief. I once listened to a debate where the non-Christian in the debate argued that Jesus had an evil twin, and he was the one who was crucified on the cross. And the real Jesus then appeared to his disciples after that. And so in part 2 of Dr. Habermas's explanation here of how the resurrection gives evidence for God's existence, we're going to be talking about some of these alternative explanations and also connect the dots on how Christ's resurrection gives us evidence for God's existence. I'm Kerry Decker, your host here on 5 Good Reasons Why God Exists. This is Kaboom. We'll be right back. Those naturalistic explanations, well, they are effective sometimes in explaining 1 or 2 of your facts. They're not effective in explaining all of your facts.
Exactly.
Yeah, because...
now, if you ask what the best explanation is...
Yeah.
There's no... Mike Lacona, a student of mine, he's got, in my opinion, he's got the best book out there right now on the historical evidence for the resurrection, about 700 pages long. And what he does is he investigates about 7 or 8 major theologians, big-name theologians, and he puts all the views on a chart, and he says exactly what you said. How many of these facts will this one account for? How many will this one account for? How many will this one account for? How many will resurrection account for?
Yeah.
And the resurrection, as he says, easily accounts for all the data. None of the other ones can account for all the data.
Yeah. And I think that that's the key, because if the disciples, let's just run with one of them. If the disciples stole the body, then what does that account for?
Well, first of all, you can't, first of all, just right off the bat, that theory has arguably, someone always wants to argue about it, but arguably, that theory has not been held by a specialist for over 200 years. You know why? It's silly. It doesn't make sense. And we have a little phrase. People make fun of our little phrases, but sometimes they're really true. And the one for this one is, liars don't make good martyrs.
Yeah, really.
See, I can be wrong and die for my faith, but I wouldn't die for my faith if I know I'm wrong.
Yeah.
Somebody who's wrong could die for their faith.
Yeah.
But a guy who knows what he's teaching is false doesn't willingly die for his faith.
Yeah, I've heard it said that people will die for what they believe is true, but not for what they know is false.
That's correct. Even if what they believe is true is wrong, they're willing to die for it.
Yeah.
That's why Buddhist priests, that's why Marxists during the Russian Revolution, people die for a lot of things because they're really committed. In fact, when someone dies for their faith willingly, what's the first thing we say? First thing we say is, wow, he or she was really committed, weren't they?
Yeah.
They were committed. They gave up everything they could in life. They laid down their lives. That's how much they believed. It's true. That tells me they believed it's true.
Yeah.
And disciples, though, if the disciples stole the body, they don't believe the resurrection is true.
Gotcha. Well, how about that it was just a hallucination?
Well, the biggest problem, there's a bunch of problems with hallucinations. I mean, no theory has more problems than hallucination. And one of them is, if you go to my larger list of facts, it's not one of my 6, but it's one of the 12 from which I gathered the 6. The empty tomb is a huge objection.
Yeah.
Because I'll ask my grad students, is the empty tomb is the hallucination theory a full tomb view or an empty tomb view? Well, hallucination is a full tomb view. If you see hallucinations, that body is still in the tomb. Oh, but wait a minute. We just rolled the stone away. There's no body there. Oh, well, that's easy. The disciple stole the body. Okay, now look what you've done. Yeah. You've got to prove hallucination and the disciple stole the body. So you're compounding your theory, you know. So,
it starts to get pretty complicated after a while.
It does. Yeah. The biggest problem for hallucinations is the groups of people who saw Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's even conceded by critics. Mm-hmm. It's in the oldest list we have that goes back to within 1 to 2 years after the cross.
Yeah.
And if, for example, an atheist like German New Testament scholar Gerhard Ludemann says the oldest that list of 1 Corinthians 15 is. It's not Paul's. Paul says, I gave you what I was given. I passed on to you what I was given. Yeah. And there are three group appearances in that early list. Mm-hmm. To the 12, to a group called all the apostles, which seems to be a fair amount larger than the 12. Yeah. Maybe it's the women, you know, some folks travel with Jesus, but they're not one of the 12. And then there's the 500.
Yeah.
And the groups make mincemeat out of the hallucination theories. That and the empty tomb. And you can think of others. Why would an hallucination, why would Paul or James, unbelievers, why would Paul or James hallucinate a risen and glorified Christ?
Yeah.
So it's tough.
You know, that list that you're talking about there in 1 Corinthians 15, 1 through 8, or that passage, you say it goes back to what now?
Well, Paul says he got it from somebody else.
Yeah.
Paul says, verse 3, I gave you what I was given. What I received, I passed on to you. And critics are the consensus New Testament position from critics. Mm-hmm. The consensus New Testament position is that thing was in existence when Paul was on his way to Damascus and met Jesus.
Yeah. Okay.
That creedal statement was already in existence when Paul was an unbeliever.
What was the date for that? You know, when
they usually date that. Well, James D.G. Dunn. He's as big a name as any historical Jesus scholar today, and not an evangelical. And Dunn says that creed was probably formalized within the first year after Jesus was raised.
Wow, yeah. So the whole concept, or the whole claim then, is that Christianity has always proclaimed the risen Christ from its very inception.
Correct.
Yeah.
Well, it had to. Mm-hmm. It had to, because the resurrection is what propelled them from doubt to assurance.
Yeah.
Paul says, again, you read the verses, when Paul said, without the resurrection, there's no faith. But that's literally true. That's just not us saying, oh, this is the most important view we have. A lot of people think that's what it means. Mm-hmm. What happens is, no, if there was a body in that tomb on Sunday morning, nobody would have believed anything.
Yeah.
It's the resurrection that propelled the whole movement, and it was shot out of a cannon.
Yeah.
See, the earliest studies today have shown that to cite one scholar, Richard Bauckham, the earliest Christology is the highest Christology. A lot of people think it took decades for them to download what Jesus was saying and realized how, I don't want to say how high and mighty, but some people think it took decades for them to unpack pre-existent, the Son of God, Lord. Come on, Lord, he's a man. Well, they think it took decades. Several scholars have pointed out, big name scholars, that that big Christology, the high, heavy Christology, started at the very beginning. You go, well, it would have taken time. No, not if you have a resurrection. Because when you see a resurrection, you get shot out of a cannon. You get, whoa, who did this guy think he was?
Yeah.
Who was he? Will you tell me? Who's the first fruits of those who sleep? Who's the only one to ever be raised from the dead? And if you get that down, you'll understand why the resurrection was shot out of a cannon from the very beginning.
Yeah. There's kind of this popular notion nowadays that Christianity smuggled this concept in from pagan sources. Well, what do you say to that?
I am writing a large study of the resurrection right now. I'm at 4,700 pages. I just finished a few months ago. I just finished 150 pages on that precise question.
Yeah.
That could have been a doctoral dissertation, 150 pages. And you know what? There is virtually no scholar, no specialist. I don't care what he believes or how liberal he is. There is Bart Ehrman. I'll go back to the atheist New Testament scholar. He spends 20 pages telling you why that view is silly.
Yeah.
And he's got a little line that he gets from another guy, a University of Chicago professor named Smith. He says, as Smith says, there are people who disappeared, and not disappeared literally, but they leave the country or they go to a faraway place, and they never return again. Or there are people who died and we never see them again. He said, and there are people who we see again, but we don't know if, we don't know if they died and were seen again. He said, but here's what you know, Bart Ehrman. He says, here's what you know. Nobody in the ancient world died and was seen again. So these so-called, the Greeks had all kinds of these views. Well, anybody can teach anything. We have myths. We have myths in our world where, movies, all kinds of stories where something dies and comes back to life.
Yeah, E.T.
We're talking about an historical person. Where is this in history?
Yeah.
And we don't have data for anything like that.
Yeah.
It doesn't make a difference whether it's questionable whether the Greeks and the Egyptians even believed that there were persons who lived and came back. It's questionable whether they even believed that, if there were any pre-Christian stories. But there weren't any historical persons who died and came back.
Gotcha.
There's no parallels to Jesus.
Yeah, and the thing that kind of rattles around in my head on that is the idea that this all started deep within the Jewish culture.
That's correct.
And right in the epicenter of the Jewish faith in Jerusalem. And come on, you expect for me to believe that they went out and brought in these pagan sources when Jews didn't even have social interaction with pagans? It's pretty far-fetched.
They weren't supposed to marry, and they weren't supposed to go into business with, and
So I just want you to touch on one other alternative really quick. And then I want you to connect the dots for me on how Christ's resurrection gives evidence for God's existence. But the other alternative, there's a movie, and I don't know if you ever saw it, called Princess Bride. And one of the famous...
That's going to be a serious objection now, right?
Yeah. One of the famous Billy Crystal, I think it was, lines in there is that he's not dead.
Let me guess. He's only mostly dead. Right. Well, that's the question about whether Jesus died on the cross.
Yeah.
And what's so interesting about that? Okay, Ben, I keep going back to Bart Ehrman because he's willing to tell you what we know from history, even though he's an atheist and he's a New Testament specialist. He gives, just for one reason, he gives 15 independent sources within 100 years. Now, that's fair. In the ancient world, to only go 100 years. Our earliest sources for Alexander the Great are almost 300 years later. Our best sources for Alexander, the two of them, Arrian and Plutarch, are 425 and 450 years later. Almost a half a millennium. So if Alexander is 300 to 450 for our best sources, our only sources, written sources for Alexander, Bart Ehrman gives 15 sources for the crucifixion from 100 years later. But they're all independent. Most of them are in the New Testament. Some of them are not. So we have that many. In the ancient world, what do you have 15 independent sources for any event?
Yeah, yeah.
We have that need for crucifixion. But also we have medical arguments today. What happens at crucifixion? The predominant view is that death by crucifixion is essentially death by asphyxiation.
Yeah.
If you hang somebody in that position, you don't have to use nails. You can tie them. You can do what you want. You can hang them from a tree. It doesn't have to be on a cross. If you suspend a person like that, the weight of their body pulls down on the muscles that surround the lungs, the intercostal, pectoral, deltoid muscles, the same muscles you work out in a gym.
Yeah.
And
maybe you work out in a gym.
Actually, I should be doing a lot more working out in a gym. Yeah, that's a good point. But if they strangle the lungs,
yeah.
In fact, in some German experiments around the time of World War II and just after World War II, they found out that if you just leave the guy alone and hang him like that, he loses consciousness in a maximum of 12 minutes.
Wow.
Well, that's a bunch of baloney. Jesus was on the cross for hours and they thought it was too soon. Right, because he could push up on the nails in the feet. Okay. But what happens you can't push up anymore? They broke the ankles of the two. That's why they broke the ankles, by the way. They weren't just being mean.
Yeah.
Not Jesus, but if you can't push up, you can't breathe.
Yeah.
To Jesus, he was already dead. How do you know? Because he had sunk down to the low. They go, where'd the Roman guard get their MD? They didn't get an MD.
Yeah.
But you see a guy hanging in the low position on the cross, that's like saying, push my head down into the water and I'm going to fake death. Well, you're not going to fake death for very long.
Yeah,
and if you're in the low position on the cross, it could be over in 10 minutes. It could be over in 20 minutes if you're in the low position. How did they know Jesus wasn't moving? Because to breathe, you have to push up. But if he's hanging low, he's in bad trouble. He's in a coma. He's somewhere, but he's not breathing.
Yeah.
And then so what do they do? According to, and Jesus isn't the only one that this happened to in the ancient world. There are several other accounts. They stab him in the side with the spear and blood and water comes out. That's a sign of death.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the separation of blood and serum. The water either comes from the pleural cavity from the crucifixion procedure when the lungs build up with a bloody fluid and it crushes the lungs and they die, or more popularly, the water came from the pericardium, which is a sac that surrounds the heart.
Yeah.
But if the spear went into the sac, it went into the heart because the sac is only paper thin. So the man who was stabbed is dead.
Yeah.
And, so he can't breathe. He's hanging low. He's stabbed in the chest. Here's the biggest problem. We haven't even said it yet. The biggest problem with believing Jesus didn't die is, let's just say he didn't die.
Yeah.
What shape would he have been in from Friday to Sunday, which is the most famous, the believed to be distance? I don't care if you want to say it's a Wednesday crucifixion. It's a third. Okay, great.
Yeah.
Wednesday crucifixion. Now he's got a half a week to recover. And he's been sitting on these nails for hours, nailed up here for hours. Now, let's say he didn't get stabbed. He's going to walk back to where the disciples are. What will he look like? Now, see, right away you laughed. We used to have a phrase in the 60s. It was a phrase called death warmed over.
Yeah.
You said, that guy looks like death warmed over. He looks really bad. Well, when Jesus knocks on the door, he says, guys,
it's
I'm
me.
here. I told you I would rise from the dead.
Yeah.
The disciples would say, look, alive you are, raised you are not.
There you go.
And the problem with saying he didn't die on the cross is that it contradicts his resurrection. You get a living Jesus, but not a resurrected Jesus. Dude, you're hurt. Sit down here. Get off your feet before you pass out. Andrew, go get some wet rags. Mary, go get a doctor. We need to help this guy. What he isn't is raised.
Yeah.
So think about this, but what you get from a Jesus who didn't die on the cross, what you get is a Jesus who wasn't raised.
Yeah.
So the theory itself is contradictory.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's not kind of public.
And there's no way that it could explain the conversion of the Apostle Paul.
Or James.
Yeah.
The brother of Jesus.
Yeah. So
these are all issues.
Yeah. So connect the dots for me. Why do you believe that Jesus's resurrection, because people could say, well, okay, we may not have a good naturalistic explanation, but you're just punting to the God did it explanation.
Okay. If that's, first of all, if you're going to do that in the university while I'm speaking, I want you to stand up and say that. I want you to say it. Because I would say to you something like this. Okay, are you going to grant the 6 facts?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you think of a naturalistic theory that works?
Yeah.
Am I punting? Because I'm going to give you a chance again. I would only be punting if there's no better solutions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a better solution?
Yeah.
Now, this is a very simple way to get there. There's a technical way to say all this, but here's where I would go. Jesus made 6 to 8 claims in his life that were utterly unique among all the founders of all the world religions.
Yeah.
They were utterly unique. We forget this, but of all the major founders of the world religions, none of them claimed to be the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
None of them claimed to be the Son of God. Muhammad, think about all the people. Muhammad, Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, they are at best prophets.
Yeah.
None of them are the Son of God. In fact, in the earliest writings, Buddha, Confucius, and Lao Tzu, Taoism, they were all naturalists.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have a deity.
Mm-hmm.
So these guys didn't say they were God.
Yeah.
Okay, so one very offensive thing Jesus would have done, and very wrong thing, presumably, is that he was the Son of God.
Mm-hmm.
That's horrible. That only a crazy man says that. Okay, what else? The next most crazy thing, I think, after saying he's the Son of God, is he said, "What you do with me determines where you spend eternity."
Yeah.
All prophets say, "I have a path." Jesus said, "I have a path," but Jesus was a little more radical than that. He said, "I am the path." You go, well, that's in John. That's late. I'm the way, the truth, and the light. Okay, do you like the way Matthew, Mark, and Luke say it? Well, they didn't say that. They did. Well, how did they say it? Jesus said, take up your cross and follow me. That's the same as I'm the way, the truth, and the light. You're following me. Why are you taking up the cross? That's my form of death. And and what you do, in fact, in that famous passage where the rich young ruler walks away and the disciples said, we've left everything for you. We've picked up our cross and left you. What do we get? Jesus said, anybody who takes up their cross and follows me, they'll be blessed now and they'll have eternal life in the life to come. So his 2 most radical claims were to be the Son of God and to be the only way to eternity. But there's other ones.
Yeah.
Christianity is the only religion where evil is part of the gospel. Evil. Now, Buddhism believes it's part of their gospel, but they say it's an illusion.
Yeah.
Christians believe that evil is real. In fact, right in the middle of our gospel account, in the Gospels, Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was really hurting, and that's understandable. So there's one, evil. Here's another one. He didn't just rise from the dead. He told everybody repeatedly he would rise from the dead before it happened. He predicted the resurrection. You go, well, only if you believe the New Testament accounts. Well, you tell me something. Why do critics think Jesus probably predicted his resurrection? Why? Because the same rules that a Bart Ehrman will use that tell you certain verses are historical and some are not, you get the crucifixion, you get the predictions out of those verses. So now here's why it's important. If I rise from the dead, that could be like, whoa, I just rose from the dead. But if I know I'm going to rise from the dead ahead of time, that tells you I am part of this world scheme. I'm part of a world view. And what did I say it was? I said my Father's raising me from the dead. And if I'm bold enough to predict it, I'm either really stupid, or if when I rise from the dead, you go, whoa. You think he was right that God did it? And if he predicted it, that means he had a worldview. He was part of the nexus of the whole world meaning. Here's another one. Jesus is the only founder of a major world religion of whom miracles are reported within his generation. Today, I wouldn't say this. I wouldn't be so unanimous, but I've seen critical scholars who don't believe the Bible is inspired say that 100%, they will say, that's not that tight, but they'll say all critical scholars believe Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. They may not believe in demons, but they think that those incidents actually happened. Well, if Jesus was already doing miracles, does that give you any insight that he's the one that was raised from the dead? He's already doing supernatural things?
Yeah.
What about that?
Yeah.
So Jesus is the last guy in the world to be raised unless what he taught was true. You go, what if there's no God? Well, then he's not going to be raised anyway. If there's no God, there's no resurrection. These aren't boo-boos, you know. These aren't mistakes. If there's no God, he's not being raised. But if there is a God, why Jesus? Because no God would raise Jesus unless Jesus was right on these outrageous things that no other founder taught. Now, by the way, his ethical life even backed it up. He wasn't some lunatic. Most people think it was the best ethical life ever lived. Jesus is more influential than anybody who ever lived. So for all those reasons together, if you don't think God did it, you tell me why there's a resurrection. Go ahead, make up a naturalistic theory. Well, what other options are there? You've got somebody raising him from the dead, because as I tell my grad students, dead men don't do much. So if Jesus couldn't raise himself, why did God do it? I don't know. He probably had a good reason. Yeah, he did. He's the Son of God. I mean, what other options does he give you?
And
so
the options get pretty narrow.
And by the way, I would say it this way. You've done, 5 arguments for God's existence? Is one of them, did you do the teleological argument, intelligent design, that kind of argument?
Yeah.
Well, think of it this way. A miracle argument is a teleological argument. Because in the resurrection, here's what you have coming together. This man is a miracle worker. He did them. He's the only one who claimed he was going to rise from the dead. He says, what you do with me is where you spend eternity. By the way, I'm the Son of God. I can forgive sins, all these outrageous things. And you watch, when I die, my Father's going to raise me from the dead. And it all happens. It's a teleological argument. It's an inductive argument based on pieces where we can check the data. And you go, that's not a scientific argument. Well, first of all, who says it has to be a scientific argument? But history is a social science. It's social science. History, and everybody accepts history. It's self-defeating not to accept history. We all allow it. You know, you have to believe all the world's famous experiments were formed in the past. You can't do them all over again. So,
exactly.
So what I'm saying is we just have a great basis here. And by the way, when someone says to me, well, I've got one last objection. There's no such thing as eternity. There's no such thing as an afterlife. I go, time out. Have you ever heard about near-death experiences? And I'll go to another area, which I'm telling you what, I debate critics today who won't talk to me about near-death experiences. Once a discussion starts, the evidence is so good for NDEs. I won't embarrass anybody, but maybe the best known, most radical skeptic today. We were dialoguing, and I said to him, he goes, well, why should I believe there's an afterlife? Why should I believe that a world is even open to resurrection? And I said, time out, let's talk about NDEs. And he literally said to me, I don't want to discuss NDEs. I don't want to discuss. Then don't ask me what kind of a world this is. If here's my point. If I already know there's an afterlife, what's wrong with me talking about a resurrection?
There you go.
That's afterlife.
I heard it.
All these together as a puzzle piece, and that's an inductive teleological argument for God.
Exactly. You know, I've heard a quote once made where it says that the difficulties of belief may be great, but the absurdities of unbelief is even greater. You know,
that's well said. You got past. There's all kinds of little things like that. Pascal's wager is another one. It makes people think. So C.S. Lewis, I'm not as crazy about the Lord Liar Lunatic argument. I think that only works if you could already show that Jesus claimed to be the Son of God. Then he's more than a prophet. But that would be another one of those arguments that say, what do you do with this kind of response? You got that. You got Pascal's wager. What side you're going to come out on? We just have, to me, the resurrection argument is an interlocking argument that locks the very unique person of Jesus with the afterlife all into the only person who could possibly be the one to raise him from the dead.
Yeah.
Now you inductive argument for life after death and for the deity of Christ.
Yeah. So, we're almost out of time here. Let me ask you a couple questions just to wrap this up. Why then are so many people, or why do so many people remain unconvinced?
I think that is really odd about that objection. I get it all the time. What's really odd about it is we think that people not believing is an argument against our believing. Okay, and here's my comeback. That assumes that everybody who doesn't believe or believes for good reasons. And if I don't believe, it's because I must have good reasons for unbelieving. Here's a story I usually tell. I'll say, okay, what if you and I are best friends, and you're single and I'm married, and I believe that the married life, I've got a great marriage, and I think that the married life is the best way to live. We're best friends. Mm-hmm. So I know this gal that I want to introduce you to, and she's willing to meet you. And I'm going to say, come on, man, we're good friends. You can trust me. I know you don't like blind dates, but let me introduce you to somebody who you're going to think is the greatest female you've ever met in your life.
Yeah.
And all right, so you go out a few times, and I go, what do you think? And you go, hey, I got to hand it to you. She's everything you say she is. Mm-hmm. And I go, hey, when's a big event? Can I be your best man? And you go, you know something? You always make this mistake. This is you talking. You always make this mistake. You think that just because somebody's really cool, I want to say I do for the rest of my life. And you're forgetting something. I don't want to get married. I like great relationships, but I don't want to get married.
Yeah.
Coming to Christ is saying I do to Jesus. My Greek professor used to translate the word whoever believes in him has eternal life. He said that word believes is a very strong word, and you can translate it who's ever committed to him.
Yeah,
to me, that's the example of commitment we have. The most famous commitment words are I do. Mm-hmm. And also when you take that vow, it's better or worse, richer or poorer, sickness and in health, till death do we part. We know what those words mean. It means, do you want me and do I want you for time and eternity, or at least while we're here on earth? Yeah. But we're making that kind of commitment. And you know what? I can think this person or that person is fantastic. I don't want to get married. And that's the big issue. People don't want that kind of relationship. Or any kind of relationship. Yeah. But that's not a judgment on the facts. They could believe the facts. Wow, she's everything you said she was. But I'm not going to get married. I'm too young. Maybe some long time from now. That's what happens. People don't want that kind of commitment.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Habermas, thank you so much for taking the time out. And thank you for hanging in there through all of the technical problems that we had.
There were some real winners, weren't there?
Yeah.
Hopefully we got it fixed and I can do some other interviews now.
Yeah. I won't send you the bill if you don't send me the bill. So.
All right. We'll call it even.
Great.
Hey, thanks a lot. Had a great time with you.
Yeah, we had plenty of great content here on 5 good reasons why God exists, and continue watching these episodes and tell your friends about it so that they too can take advantage of the great content that you'll find here. That's it for now. I'll see you next time.